I don't know if your audio is on or your verbal. There you go.
There it is.
Long time.
Takes a minute.
Oh, is
Ignore
that
the
you?
fact that
You had that last time?
yeah.
Other? Oh, I'm just not very perceptive. Or
Look,
maybe
I have a lot of tattoos, so I mean,
I know you had some tattoos, but maybe you had longer sleeves on last time, or maybe I just didn't see it. I don't know. Probably
maybe I don't
not. I'm
know.
probably not perceptive.
Someday I'll do a tattoo tour.
Okay,
Keep it real interesting.
fair enough. So I want to pretty much start out with your topic, but I was
Yeah,
thinking we could also fold in some Randy Weaver as well
definitely.
as potentially military industrial complex. And those actually can connect to each other, believe it or not, in some interesting ways. But your topic, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, I was gonna say Randy Weaver actually ties into Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombings, and it happens to be the anniversary of those bombings today.
Are you serious? This is
I'm serious.
easy. Like oh my god! Like there's so many coincidences recently where I got a book about the assassination of Martin Luther King coincidentally on the anniversary of his assassination. Like there, a bunch of these weird things have been happening recently. Okay.
Yeah, it's strange. Like, there's just so much going on in the world where it's like, what's happening? I don't know.
Well, all of the focus is, this is why I like having these conversations, because all of the focus is obviously on the virus. So we can just take a step back and have these interesting conversations. By the way, you are definitely a kindred spirit in that this stuff, it's just the stuff that you can't talk about in any polite company. You know what I mean? Like if you bring up, if somebody goes, "Oh, so like what are you interested in at like a cocktail party or something like that?" Not that I
Yeah,
find myself at many cocktail parties, but
can't say I've been to one recently.
but this is the kind of stuff that sucks the oxygen out of the room if you bring it up. People just look at you like, "Ooh."
Oh yeah, no, I mean like people will be like, "Oh, okay, so like I recently got accepted to grad school." Um and
Congratulations.
it's thank you. It's for professional writing and communication, but I do intend to pursue my doctorate in genocide studies and Holocaust studies. And when people ask me, "Sarah, what are you working on?" I'll be like, "Oh, the rise and resurgence of neo-Nazism and white supremacy in America." And people just be like, "Okay, that's nice."
Yeah, they were expecting to be able to give a canned response, and
Yeah,
like,
just like, "Oh, just writing."
yeah, you sort of cut that out from under them when you say something like that.
Yeah, I kind like I've gotten the look from people before, just like, "Did you okay, cool." And then I
Like,
follow it up.
really.
I follow it up quickly with like, "My grandparents were survivors. I'm not crazy." But it doesn't seem to help as much as I'd like it to.
Yeah, people don't really know where to go with that in general. So, this has to be just a day where people kind of across the far right celebrate. It's just a big, I don't know what their calendar looks like, but it's got to have like Waco, Ruby
Yeah.
Ridge, and Oklahoma City bombings.
Yeah, I mean, what was interesting was Ruby Ridge actually led in to Waco. Ruby Ridge was an 11-day standoff, kind of a botched arrest attempt. It's Ruby Ridge is probably, in my opinion, the toughest thing to understand throughout the research that I've done,
Mm.
just because it's backwards, confusing. It takes a lot to kind of like sit down and try to put out the timeline of events.
It's
But
dense.
sorry,
It's dense. It's a
it
dense
is.
timeline.
It is. I've watched a couple documentaries on it, and that's helped a little bit. But it was a building block for the Waco siege that lasted for 51 days, with the overtones of a religious cult led by David Koresh and the Branch Davidians that came off of the Seventh Day Adventist Church. So it was absolutely. I mean, it was heart wrenching when you read it, like what went on in there, and then outside at the gates of what's called Mount Carmel,
Mhm.
or I think it's Carmel.
Which
where
is
they
the
had,
like the kind of their warehouse style church building, right?
yeah, they had their compound there,
Yeah,
and um, they named it Mount Carmel after a holy site in, I believe, Israel.
Mhm.
Um, and what was just crazy is that Timothy McVeigh, the perpetrator of the Oklahoma City bombings, was outside with other. I'm sorry, the yawns are real.
No, that's okay. I'm exhausted as well.
All that I've gotten very into yard work lately because I have nothing else to do.
Me too. That's why I'm exhausted as well. I was
I
actually
know.
cutting things with a chainsaw today, so that's yeah. Yard
I
work.
was raking, but change it up once in a while.
Mhm.
Um, but anyway, so Timothy McVeigh was actually at the uh, the gate,
Mhm.
and he was at the gate at one point. He wasn't there when everything popped off, and at the time, Janet Reno gave the okay
Janet
to.
Reno was Attorney General under Clinton.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, so
Um,
this is what, like 93 or 94, roughly 92.
you know what? I'm gonna pull up my paper because
Okay.
I've got
I
all
know
the.
it's early 90s. I just 90s was so. This is what boggles my mind. And granted, maybe this is taught more now, but the 90s was so densely packed with world events and domestic events, particularly domestic terrorism, that it's mind-boggling to me that that wasn't taught in school. Maybe that was just because the curriculum was too new. It shouldn't have been too new when we were in school, though, because it was still like a decade or a decade and a half earlier.
Well,
So,
I mean, if you look at it from this perspective, I'm going through my notes here.
uh-huh.
Ruby Ridge took place from August 21st to August 31st in in the late 70s.
Yeah, no, 90s. Wait, Ruby Ridge?
Ruby Ridge, which led into the Waco siege.
Ruby Ridge was 90s.
Ruby Ridge?
Yeah, it was like early 90s, and then Waco was early 90s too. They were relatively close to each other.
Oh yeah, no. Randy Weaver started going to stuff in the 70s,
Okay. Yeah.
and I just want to make sure I have my facts right because if I'm wrong, then we got a problem.
Yeah, Randy. That
Oh
must
yeah, it
have
was in
been,
'92, and
okay.
then yeah,
Yeah.
he started going to the Aryan Nations meetings.
Okay.
Um, sorry, I got that wrong.
No, that's okay.
Um,
Like that really would have thrown my timeline.
yeah, no, it all happened in a very quick span. From Ruby Ridge, the Waco siege begins, and Timothy McVeigh is actually there early on. He had been in the military, much like Hitler. He had achieved a lot, much like Hitler. So the disillusionment that came from him brought about these neo-Nazi movements and these anti-government uprisings from him.
Mm.
He was selling, uh, you know, white supremacy propaganda and swastika stickers outside of Waco.
Mhm.
And he got the news when he was in Michigan. It says in the book American Terrorist
Mhm.
that he did, or not that he did, but he was interviewed for before he was executed. And he does remain the only domestic terrorist executed in the U.S. But
That's interesting.
yeah, he to this
I
day,
had
because
that
he's
title.
yeah he well, it's because he blew up the Alfred P. Murrah building as just a sheer act of defiance against the American government. Um,
And he just
which
chose that specifically because it represented government, right? He didn't.
yeah,
Was there something in there? I don't remember if it was like a specific sort of bureau within that building. I know it represented government as a whole, but
well, he did not he MSNBC and Rachel Maddow
Mhm.
did this thing called the McVeigh tapes, where
Yeah.
they played hours and hours of his testimony from prison before He was executed. And basically what it came down to was he opened the phone book, searched for government, landed on the Alfred P. Murrah building, and decided that's where I'm going.
Doesn't
One
sound
of
very
the
sophisticated.
what?
Doesn't sound very sophisticated, the research that he did.
Not really. And I mean, there was speculation that because there were like military recruiting offices and whatnot,
Oh, okay. That might be what I'm
that,
talking about.
but it's relatively unknown if he knew about it or not. It's just that's conjecture brought on by other people,
Okay.
biographers and whatnot. But
So, just real quick, the 90s, I think this really paints the context of the era. This is what I think I've kind of pieced together is the 90s were this seed bed of far right activity in the United States, and particularly groups like the Klan and the neo-Nazis were being watched because there was a lot of um, terrorist incidents like bank robberies and bombings and assassination attempts and things like that. And there were these ideology, like when a lot of people think far right, I think they automatically say, well, that means like Nazism. But they're sort of like, there's this confluence of different ideologies that I almost think about it like a Venn diagram with a bunch of circles and they overlap each other. So you have like hardcore anti-government ideology, you have anti-New World Order ideology, like anti-super world government ideology. You have racial ideology. You have survivalist and kind of prepper ideology. You have hardcore religious ideology, um, and all of those blend together in some ways, and sometimes they're separate from each other.
exactly, it's almost like a tier system
Yeah.
too, because and has a domino effect because one begets another. Um, what's actually interesting about the KKK was it would actually originated by a group of Confederate veterans. It got some power, tapered off, got some power, tapered off, and then has remained a staple of just complete hate.
Yeah.
Uh, most recently, they were involved in, they've been in high profile events. The 2015 Charleston church shooting,
Mm-hmm.
the 2017, the Unite the Right rally in
Oh, yeah.
Charlottesville, 2018's Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, and in the shooting at the Walmart in El Paso all had ties to the KKK. And what doesn't stop them is the fact that it's freedom of speech.
Yeah.
But when you really do a deep dive into it, you can go so far down a rabbit hole. There's this thing called
Oh,
like
yeah.
the 3% militia, that is all about taking back their guns. And
I didn't
they
even
say
talk about that. The militia movement and the gun movement is another huge
it's
ideology.
it's insane. I mean, I to an extent I understand the right to bear arms. It is an amendment
Mhm.
and everything, but when you take it to the extreme
Mm,
that people do. I mean, I understand hunting for food. I understand, that primary basis, but when you take it to the point of creating your own militia movement and saying we're not white supremacists, we just like white people, you kind of have to take pause and go, do do you hear yourself? Do
yeah,
you hear what you just said?
that's where it blends together in weird ways. And this is where it gets tough and um well, actually, first thing that I do want to take a step back for a sec, because another thing that I think is really important and worth mentioning, and why I think a lot of this really rose up at this period in time, is because the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and it created this vacuum. And a lot of and this is actually going to relate not just to Nazism and the Klan and all that, but also towards the military-industrial complex that we talk about later. But
Yeah.
you have this vacuum of power where a lot of people, generally leaning more towards the liberal and progressive side, have this idea of like, well, what's next? What role should the United States play? You end up with neoliberals and neoconservatives, and you have this idea of, well, we should have sort of like a one world government. This is now that we don't have these two warring, this bipolar world. Now that we have this monopolar world, we could have a one world government, and we could all kind of unite. That whole concept of the New World Order, which was very big under the Clinton administration, that really freaked a lot of the right out.
And what's interesting is that the New World Order is an offshoot of so many different things. Like when Hitler died or committed suicide, and what's actually an interesting parallel. David Koresh, the leader of the Branch Davidians at Waco, was found with a gunshot wound to the head.
Yeah.
Exact same way Hitler died, following similar ideologies, and it's believed that he went out as a martyr. That being said, just on the other side of things, the Nazi Party became the American Nazi Party, coming over to America about a decade after Hitler took his own life. And those ideologies that should have died in the Berlin bunker, where he did too, came over to Arlington, Virginia with George Lincoln Rockwell, who became the figurehead of the newest Nazi movement. And since then, there's been all of these different offshoots and different branches of things that happen. So one thing that I think a lot of people don't realize, because maybe they're not doing a deep dive into this horror, is that the KKK, in the grand scheme of things, while they're a hate group, no doubt, there are so many other like smaller, almost splinter cell type organizations that have the power to do some serious damage because they fly under the radar so quickly.
Yeah, I've done some searching around on the Southern Poverty Law Center website, and I have sort of mixed views on the Southern Poverty Law Center, because on one side, it's a phenomenal resource for not only the different ideologies, but also the different groups and the different people. They have profiles on all three: high profile people, high profile ideologies, high profile groups. And it's a great resource, but I also question sometimes who they include on it. In general, they tend to be pretty good, but that's a really good point that you make. And it also makes me think of how with the Klan, granted they're like a group to be taken seriously, but they're also sort of these elements of, along with every element of drama, there's comedy kind of tightly interwoven into it. And so like I look at having that conversation with Daryl Davis, he talks about how the different groups of the Klan kind of like compete with each other, and a lot of them hate each other. And that was
a great conversation, by the way. I listened to that and I was just like, yes.
Thank you for saying that. And John Ronson, that book that I was talking about, Them, when he goes and he spent some time with the Klan, there was this one Klan group that he was with that the guy was really, the local Klan leader was really, like every time one of the Klan members said the N-word, he got like really upset, and he knew that was really bad PR, and he's trying to like give the Klan like this makeover basically, and it's just like kind of this dark comedic chapter in the book where you're like, dude, that's not gonna work, that the Klan is the Klan.
Yeah, I mean, like when you look at it though, like when you watch the documentaries, and unfortunately I've watched way too many of them to try to understand it, and I think I said it at one point about, I think it was talking to a narcissist is like talking to a brick wall. Is a lot like watching all of these documentaries. It's like essentially watching just rampant stupidity in a slightly different format. And it's like, I would assume it's like talking to a brick wall, because there's these people that have these assumed positions of power where they're like a grand wizard, which in and of itself is humorous. And then, you look at it and it's like, you want to go, what are you doing? Like, what?
Yeah.
Why? Let's just start with just why, you know? And it gets me because not just because of my own history, having, survivor grandparents and everything, but
Mhm.
I don't, like you said, it's one of those things where you can't, unless you've got a kindred spirit to talk to, you can't really bring it up and be like, this is what I'm thinking about right now.
Yeah.
Like, I get stuck on the why so much.
Mhm.
Like, why do we hate the different? And that's something I've never understood, and I think for a lot of what I'm doing, I don't understand it, but I see so many parallels. It all ties together, and this being the anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombings, you look at the ideologies of Randy Weaver, David Koresh, and then Timothy McVeigh.
Mhm.
They almost
The
perfectly,
trifecta heroes.
yeah, the literal patron saints of young neo-Nazis, in which I'll get into later because those are just it's bad
Yeah.
to say the least. You look at those ideologies, you look at how those people behaved, and you look at Hitler ideologies, you look at Trump ideologies,
Mhm.
and as they all come together, it's this amalgamation of pretty much the same thing. So when you kind of begin to try to vet it out and figure out, okay, what made these people different? Time period and technology.
Mm.
And that's like the big thing that I've come to is, as as time has gone on, there's been a better way to gain bigger traction, for groups, whether they're neo-Nazi groups, hate groups, it runs the gambit. But when you look at it and you kind of you take a step back, you read out the ideologies, you
Mhm.
look at what these people did, you kind of come to this point where it's like all these people have a lot in common. No real family, like nuclear family, to look at,
Mhm.
which is not to say someone that doesn't have a nuclear family is going to do this, but caught at the right moment by somebody that gave them the concept of a family.
Mhm.
Add that in,
Vulnerable at a point of vulnerability.
a point of vulnerability, exactly. Add that in with, okay, yeah, you can be a part of this family, but this is what we believe in, because young impressionable minds, or disillusioned minds, like in the case of Timothy McVeigh, um, it lends itself so much to just, it lends hatred. And I don't fully understand, I don't know if I ever will fully understand why hatred is the route to go. I mean, if you're taking people in and going, okay, this is a family setting that we can give to you, why are we going for like the extremes
Mm.
of horror? And I mean, I'm attempting to figure that out, and it's hard.
It is, but I mean, you have the right mentality where I've been thinking a lot about the human capacity for empathy and compassion, and how this degree of empathy or compassion to try to figure out how the worst behavior comes about and how somebody goes down these roads, how that's sort of like a truer personality-based empathy, where there's a lot of empathy that people have simply because of social pressure. There's like a social pressure empathy or compassion that people simply demonstrate because they know that it would be taboo, or they would face some type of shaming if they didn't show it. But outside of that limited amount of compassion or empathy, they don't show it. But this is like sort of like a true empathy, deep overarching compassion, which is like, hey, even the worst people, or the worst behavior, you can sort of try to find out how somebody got there, or give people a path to redemption, and forgiveness, before they get too far down that road. And I think it is like a ratchet where people originally like they people don't have a lot somebody doesn't have a lot going on in their life, and they encounter these ideas and they're kind of edgy, and they see that other people, like, you know, it gets a reaction or a rise out of people. Other people are like, oh no, like that's taboo. And then they kind of start to go down that road, and then they start to get shunned. And then once they get shunned, or people, you know, belittle them in some way, or something like that, then it pushes them further towards the edge. When you have groups being like, oh yeah, just we'll accept you, come to us. If they don't accept you, we will. And I also think that I'm not just trying to recreate the conversation with Daryl Davis here, but I do think there's also this idea of having to have somebody beneath you. Because if you look at a lot of these guys who end up becoming, you know, a neo-Nazi or a Klansman or something like that, they tend to be from impoverished, blue-collar, working-class areas. And they, I think, feel looked down upon by other white people that act elitist, you know, coastal white people, or people who are from the north or whatever, right? And I think they have this sort of like inferiority complex, and they're like, well, I'm not going to be the bottom of the totem pole or the bottom of the social hierarchy or whatever. I need somebody beneath me. And then that becomes like the intense focus on how I'm not, my inferiority can't be like, my sense of inferiority can't be true if I insist that somebody else is much more deeply inferior than me. Minorities, immigrants, Catholics, Jews, whatever, right?
I completely agree with that. That is such a good summation of kind of how it works. And you know, to jump forward a lot of years,
Mhm.
like let me take you to 2017
Sure.
for instance, because this caught my attention when I was first looking at the newer neo Nazis and how it happens. I'm sure you're familiar with like a website 4chan,
Yeah.
because who
I
hasn't?
don't actually really go on it, but I know how it's like it can turn
I I
cesspool.
haven't either. I've been on it once
Uh-huh.
for research, and that was like the the worst 5 minutes of my life.
Is it
And
like
got
basically going on Stormfront? Like it's just
there's Stormfront and what is it? There's Iron.
Daily Stormer.
Yeah, I unfortunately have had to like go on these websites to gain some understanding for what I'm working on, and it's just like it makes your skin crawl.
Yeah, particularly the propaganda cartoons, you know,
Oh
like the
my gosh, yeah.
Shylocks and the things like that, where you look at these and you're like, ugh.
Yeah, so in 20 I found this article and I read it and then I did a deep dive into these people. And so I started looking at the Atomwaffen division. And this brings us kind of to
Oh
present day.
yes, I've seen them on Southern Poverty Law Center.
Yeah, the Atomwaffen division operates in the US, the UK, Germany, Canada, the Baltic states. Um, there's so many different orders, but the Atomwaffen division in America is headquartered in Florida, and that's pretty much where the troubles began. Like first kind of really got on the radar in 2017.
Mhm.
Allergies are god awful this season. I'm just throwing that out there.
Is it
Uh,
what is it, pollen or?
yeah, like I walk outside and I'm like, cool, can't breathe. This is great. Um, but you know, so for my part, I found this very interesting, and I'm just gonna run through it really quick. Friday, May 19th, 2017, in Tampa, Florida, 22-year-old Jeremy Himmelman and 18-year-old Andrew Wanchuk are found dead. They shared an apartment with two other young men in a gated community near the University of South Florida, and another roommate, 21-year-old Brandon Russell, had found them first, and he saw that they were shot execution style in the head. And police arrive moments later, and Russell surrenders immediately because he doesn't know what's going on or why his roommates are dead. But his fourth roommate, Devin Arthurs, arrives back at the apartment with the police, having calmly just walked into the leasing office of the property and said, yeah, I murdered these people. he's unfazed by it. Arthur's seeing it all as a necessity and collateral damage. Now, the 18-year-old was notedly casual in explaining why his apartment contained multiple copies of Mein Kampf and a framed picture of Timothy McVeigh, and a cache of ammunition and chemicals to build homemade explosives. And the reasoning behind the murders entirely was his formerly like-minded alt-right roommates had decided they didn't want to build a Fourth Reich, and Arthur's lost it and went on a murdering rampage.
Okay, that's slightly suspect.
It's very suspect. So you look kind of
photo of Timothy McVeigh, and that'll
framed photo of Timothy McVeigh, swastika flags and posters, North Korean flags.
North Korean.
Yeah, because they've got it all together over there.
That seems inconsistent. Like that's communist.
Well, yeah, but I mean, think about what you're dealing with.
Yeah, I'm not saying that there's consistency.
So I did a deeper dive into this, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, how did these people find each other? And you know that finding information online and the ability to hide behind a keyboard and spew like anger and hatred with anonymity is faster than like instant pudding.
Yeah.
And in the case of Himmelman, Wunschuk, Russell, and Arthurs, they met online in 4chan where they could espouse extremist fascist ideals that they all shared. And they came from similar backgrounds, absent parents, lax rules. They were all considered outcasts at school, rebels with a terrible cause to promote Hitlerism, extreme right-wing views, and to quote unquote make racism funny from one of the articles that I read, and that brought them together and would ultimately blow them apart. Devin Arthurs was given too much freedom as a child, and because he ran his household, pretty much he had free reign to think however he wanted, and the way that he went, unfortunately, was down a terrible path. Kids at his school had deemed him quote unquote insane because he would frequently talk about being a national socialist and believing that Aryan superiority was quote willing to die for national socialism. And that is almost the same verbatim from Hitler that aligns with socialist ideology that Timothy McVeigh believed in, bringing you to the framed portrait.
This is interesting. It makes me think about, there was a book that I read recently called The War Against Boys by Christina Hoff Sommers, and she talks about how there was a turn against moral education at some point in like the 80s and 90s. It was sort of around the time of the self-esteem movement, and how it was considered like judgmental or forceful to try to impart ethics and morals against particularly, like, I think against anybody, but particularly against like young boys in school, and in like generally more often than girls, boys need this moral, ethical sort of scaffolding around them, and if they don't have it and they're allowed to do things like talk about dying for the Third Reich or the Fuhrer or whatever you were just saying, then if nobody pushes back against that, then it just ratchets and it escalates. And by the way, this fascinates me. I didn't know this until recently, that Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the Columbine shooters, they actually revered Timothy McVeigh, and they had wanted to, their original plot was to blow up the school and kill essentially everybody there. But technically, as horrific as their crime was, they failed in their original intent, which was to mimic what McVeigh and, well, I guess, I don't know, McVeigh and Terry Nichols, right?
Right, and what I've never understood about that whole thing is McVeigh was put to death, and I think he was sentenced for like 60-something murders, whereas Terry Nichols is in prison for life with like 100 and something charges against him, which I don't understand, and hopefully someday I'll figure out. But it's just one of those things that, like, I don't fully understand the American justice system.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that. I think oftentimes it's just inconsistent and it fucks up, and it will just be like, oh yeah, but that was the way that it was supposed to happen, and you're like, yeah, I don't think it was, but
And it's like, flag on the play here, real quick.
exactly. And by the way, that guy Gerald Posner that wrote the book Pharma, he
Yeah.
actually he has a short book called, like, I think it's called The Third Man,
Hmm.
about he had investigated, there was apparently potentially a third guy that might have gotten away from the Oklahoma City bombing.
There was, and that came up in the McVeigh tapes. I don't remember his name, but there was a third guy that backed out, like, within hours of it happening, just backed out and was
Yeah,
gone.
and they just never really investigated it or something like that.
Couldn't find him, I guess.
That's crazy. All right. Side note.
But it's funny that you bring up not funny, haha, but it's funny that you bring up Columbine, because you remember I was a junior, so you're probably a sophomore when Rachel's Challenge came to our high school.
I don't remember what that was.
It was
Sounds familiar.
the brother of the first victim of the Columbine shootings, Rachel. Shit, I don't remember her last name at the moment.
Mhm.
But basically brought Rachel's Challenge about being kind and teaching us about what happened at Columbine.
Yeah.
Um, and if you Google Rachel's Challenge, it's very interesting, but that piqued my interest in why. Like, you see school shootings all the time. In fact, this past March 2020, was the first March since 2002 that there were no school shootings.
That, granted, the media cycle is messed up in how it just, like, focuses on one thing entirely, and then, but I had been thinking about that recently. And wait, you said in March?
Yeah,
And that was probably because there was nobody at school, right?
exactly.
It
And
was purely because there was nobody. Yeah.
exactly. And I was
That's
thinking
interesting.
about it. Um, I was thinking about it like earlier because I was doing some work, and the news is always on in my house, and I was listening to it, and then I hear there was a shooting rampage in Nova Scotia, and there was a shooting rampage somewhere else, and I was like, really? But that aside, uh, that's this whole other issue. But
Nova,
when, hmm?
Nova Scotia, huh?
Yeah,
That just doesn't strike me as a place that. None of these places actually that these shootings have happened strike you as places that this stuff happens. So never mind. Dumb
I mean,
comment.
and Columbine. The thing with Columbine was that maybe I was a senior. I don't remember, and it doesn't matter at this moment. But um, when we had that assembly, I actually read a book by what is his name? David. So I'll look it up in a second, but a book just called Columbine, and he's
Sure.
written another one called Newtown, and it's an incredible book, and I'm gonna look it up right now because I highly recommend it. It's so well written, um, that if you're looking to just kind of try to Dave Cullen wrote it, and he wrote Newtown, among some other stuff, and it's very well written. It's very laid out, and I read the book, and I mean it was terrifying. But in there's also excerpts from their journals, Dylan and Eric, and I think that was something that when you get down to it, they not only idolized Timothy McVeigh, but they idolized Hitler. There were drawings of swastikas in their journals, and one thing that the media has changed is that now they really don't highlight the names of the perpetrators anymore, especially the school shootings,
Yeah.
because if you go online and you type in Dylan, Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris, as I've done for research, what's disgusting, absolutely, like, it'll sicken you. There are
There are
fan
fandoms.
pages,
Fandoms.
there,
Yeah.
fandoms completely devoted to these two people whose complete goal in life was to cause as much destruction and mayhem as humanly possible. And thank God they failed to the level that they did.
I saw a Vice documentary, a mini documentary about that recently, and maybe you've seen it before, or something like it, where the guy went to interview two girls who were part of the Columbine shooter fandom. And one of them actually, about a couple years back, went to Colorado, and they were kind of tracking her because I think she had a shotgun or something like that.
I saw this one.
Yeah. She had committed suicide in Colorado. And then there was one of her friends that the Vice documentary guy was talking to, and he was just saying, like, why? What do you see in this? And she was kind of explaining, I was depressed, and I see beauty sort of in some of his depressed writings. And like, granted, I understand from that perspective of like seeing sort of a kindred spirit and a fellow person, a fellow human who is depressed. But there's also like, obviously, hey, this guy committed mass murder as well.
Yeah.
But it was an very interesting documentary.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the parallels too, like there are a lot of writers with great notoriety that suffered from, various mental illnesses, depression, anxiety, you name it, and you can find camaraderie there. To go searching, and I feel like a hypocrite saying it because I go searching for these manifestos and stuff all the time, but for research, I feel like it's worth noting that I think these people on a whole are absolutely disgusting.
Yeah.
And reading their stuff, sometimes I literally have to put it down and just like go outside and remember that these are just a few people in a very big world.
Yeah.
Because
I relate to you in that regard, because and I think this goes back to the empathy thing as well, and also research. It's not just a voyeurism. It's definitely a deep interest. But I've read things like this too. I read Mein Kampf. I read the Turner Diaries.
The Turner Diaries is what Timothy McVeigh based what he did off of, a fictional book. And he was like, let's make that real. Great plan.
I mean, I definitely, reading that book, I was like, well, yep, here you go. This is the plot right here. And then the Unabomber Manifesto too. And granted, as as disturbing as each of these texts is, it paints, and these aren't texts that I go out and tell other people. Like, I think that they need to be handled responsibly in an academic context. I would never just like throw this up and be like, hey, everybody read this.
I'd say, read Columbine or read Newtown for their academic and like empathetic qualities and stuff, because it's not saying, this is good. It's saying like, this is what it is. But
exactly. But it is incredible how it paints a broader picture of, it really connects dots as to things that happened, the way that people were thinking. It really is interesting. It is almost like a peering into the mind of history, in the mind of sort of delusion, like mass delusion.
Yeah, you were saying something about a little while ago about like men needing to kind of like have that alpha feeling, sort of.
Yeah.
Do you remember? I want to say it was 2014. I might have the year wrong, but the shootings in Isla Vista, Elliot Rodger.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
I remember that. And
what is it? The term again? Incel, involuntary celibate. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I started looking at that briefly just to see if it had anything to do with what I'm studying, and unfortunately, it does.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the incel ideology is very, very similar to, more so, it doesn't align completely with the white supremacy stuff, but it aligns with supremacy just as a person.
Oh yeah.
And if you watch his videos that are still on YouTube, and you can read his manifesto, and I did for a project I was doing on, you guessed it, neo-Nazism. I read his entire manifesto, and that is the writings of a legitimately disturbed young man.
Yeah, I think that male sexual frustration is a vein that you can follow through a lot of these things. And
Definitely.
obviously, sexual slash um, gender supremacy is something that is pretty well integrated into a lot of this ideology.
Yeah, I mean, I personally haven't really found many women that have been involved in this stuff, and they are. Like, if you watch the Vice documentary on the 3% militia, which I definitely recommend,
Mhm.
um, there are women out there, but the perpetrators that are really out there, like you remember Anders Breivik in Norway, who shot up a summer camp.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. I don't
He
know much
was
about that.
I know a small amount. There was another man in the Atomwaffen division who idolized Breivik, who also idolized Breivik idolized McVeigh.
Hmm. Okay.
And it's when you talk about connecting the dots in my mind's eye, there's just this circle, this never-ending circle of the same ideas and the same ideologies, just changed a little bit, just to mess things up just a little bit more.
Yeah.
And
It's individual, like that's what makes this more on the right, is a lot of this tends to be more like lone wolf, individualized. That's kind of what makes it harder to track, is it's less there are militia movements and things like that, but a lot of these people sort of like go rogue, right? I mean,
yeah,
you look at somebody like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and this guy's out in a cabin, and he's not really. He was like anti-technological modern system, so he had sort of his own brand of this. But a lot of these, they're obvious, as you talk about, they're far disproportionately men,
white men.
white men. Yes, definitely, they're all white men.
Yeah.
But actually, taking a step back, um, to Ruby Ridge, Randy Weaver, I actually do think that in that case, interestingly, Vicky Weaver was, from what I've read, sort of the one who was leading the pursuit of. She had the religious ideology, and
Definitely.
she was the one that really wanted to get out of Iowa, get out of this Rust Belt farm crisis, and move to this religious type hill residence out in rural Idaho. And
Yeah,
it sounded like, granted, Randy Weaver was more of his ideology was more like just anti-government and anti-New World Order and survivalist, essentially.
yeah. They built
Uh,
this compound out in Hayden
it,
on Ruby Ridge.
yeah, and by the way, okay, this is, I'm glad that we're sort of into Randy Weaver again, because I did want to talk about sort of the making of Randy Weaver, and
Yeah,
this is something that I just touched on with Daryl Davis, and then he was kind of like, and I was like, all right, I guess I'm not gonna go down this road, but like, I do actually, I sympathize with Randy in certain ways, where like, so this he so the concept of New World Order, it it generally sort of is this idea of kind of like a communist one world government that we need to get rid of. But then there's this other idea of New World Order that borrows much more heavily from Nazi ideology of the New World Order is a secret cabal of Jews that is running things. They're the puppeteers. And so this is what I found interesting is Randy Weaver and Vicky Weaver with their children, they get out to rural Idaho, and they've got no neighbors, pretty much from what I gather, anywhere nearby except for an Aryan Nations compound. And
exactly.
and so like these are just like very fringe. I like when you're somebody like Randy Weaver and Vicky Weaver, you probably don't have many options as to like the community that you choose to have around you, and the resources, the human your fellow humans that you have to kind of come to your aid and make connections with. So there's only the thread that connects the Weavers to the Aryan nations is that they both believe in a new world order kind of concept, and they're geographically nearby each other. And I actually had heard, and I think this was more like Randy's words, and I don't know how much I can really trust him about this, but he said that he would often get into arguments with the Aryan nations because they would be like, "Oh no, man, the New World Order is all it's the Jews," and he was more like, "No, I don't actually think it's like any one group. I think it's just like people want to the cosmopolitan people of the world want to get together and create this global system." And it's difficult for me because I do see how it almost became the Ruby Ridge situation took on a momentum of its own. And once the media heard about the Aryan nations, it immediately switched, the narrative switched to Aryan nations or white supremacist Randy Weaver. And that became the thing that the media would pick up on everywhere. And ever since then, it became white supremacist Randy Weaver. And then you, not only that, but once Randy is having his standoff up on Ruby Ridge, that's when the Aryan nations and these local white nationalist groups, white supremacist groups, whatever, that's when they start to take credit for Randy Weaver and be like, yeah, he's one of us. He's one of us. It's almost like when shit like bombings happen or something occurs in the world, how like, you know, ISIS and whatever terrorist groups are like, yeah, that was us. We did that. And like, it gets difficult to follow because I do think that Randy Weaver has definitely said some things that are highly questionable and highly tinged towards like racial supremacy and things like that. But I'm sort of like, is this something that Randy Weaver actually believes, or does he have so few people that are on his side that he feels like he has to say these things because the only people who are on his side are the ones that are like, you know, yeah, we'll take you on or we support you. He has so few people that like he's such a niche product and
He's
ideology.
yeah, he's his own little faction. And one thing that I will say that as is passed over, I don't think it's talked about enough that, you know, he never actually joined the Aryan nations. Um and the Aryan nations, you know, the FBI and Rand Corporation immediately deemed them a domestic terrorist threat. But they're based off the teachings of Wesley Swift. And he was a figurehead in the Christian identity movement, and that's a racist offshoot of British Israelism. So it was anti-Semitic views, racism, fascism, Holocaust denial, and retribution. So
That was like Jews and minorities are like the mud people, right? Isn't
exactly.
that, yeah, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So essentially, it was touted initially as a Christianity-based movement. And Randy Weaver, you know, he was interested in it, but he never became a member. But he shared the ideologies, and he was a separatist, which is kind of what changed his part in it, if you will. But at one meeting, I mean, I'm sure you know, he met an undercover informant for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and they purchased 2 illegally sawed-off shotguns from him. And he refused to become an informant for them, so a warrant went out for his arrest from the U.S. Marshals. But by then, he'd moved his family off the grid into Boundary County, which was near Ruby Ridge. So getting him out was going to be difficult. And it was kind of a botched arrest from the U.S. Marshals in the way you look at it, because they were obviously a gun-toting family, the Weaver family. And they, you know, they were, the U.S. Marshals at one point were given a shoot on sight order, you know, as they were up in the hills watching the compound and stuff. And with that, you know, Weaver's son, wife, and unfortunately, and I don't know why this hit me the hardest, but the dog, they had to kill the dog. The dog's not armed. That bothered me, but
Oh yeah, I agree.
but that was in the first 2 days of the standoff. There's 9 days after that, and I wonder to myself, you know, okay, Randy Weaver, definitely a question mark of an individual, clearly not all there.
Mhm.
That's his deal. I mean, he's gone now, or yeah, I think he's gone now.
Randy, I believe, is still alive, but I don't know. I thought he was like in his 70s now.
I mean, he's gone off of the map
Oh,
of
okay, gotcha. Yeah.
yeah. He's as far as I know still with us, but he's gone off of the map of, being able to uh do anything else.
Mhm.
I do wonder because Ruby Ridge, no matter how many documentaries you watch or how much you read, it is very confusing.
Yeah.
Like I've watched this. There's a really great series called The American Experience, and on Netflix they have it, and they have one on Ruby Ridge, one on the Waco Siege, and one on Oklahoma City,
Sure.
and I recommend them.
Also, there's another documentary that was pretty great, and I recommend the series in general. There's CNN. I generally don't watch cable news at all, but the CNN Decades series, they're
Yeah,
all on Netflix. The 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, thousands, and for the 90s, there's an episode called like Domestic Terror or Terrorism Comes Home or something like that.
yeah,
Really great episode. Check that out.
and on MSNBC there's On Assignment with Richard Engel, and he recently did one called The Age of Hate, which I'll get into because it was insane. But the whole thing with Randy Weaver is I occasionally wonder, because it can be looked at as a botched attempt at an arrest, and things could have gone a million different ways. Maybe if he had just gone to court,
Yeah.
things would have been different. But it's that's starting to tip on the butterfly effect. If one thing
Yeah.
had been changed.
There were like there's no person or group in that story that you can look at and say that they didn't mess up in some way. And the first, with this often doesn't get covered, but the government, when they issued their warrant, they gave the wrong date, and then he didn't show up. And granted, he probably wouldn't have shown up even if it was the correct date. But they declare the bench warrant to like, all right, well, this has gone from a what did it start out as alcohol? It started out ATF, and then it went to marshals, and then from marshals, once the marshal got killed, to FBI. But
Yeah,
but once he didn't show up in court, it went from ATF to the marshals. All right, go get him. And
yeah,
they hadn't put the right date on the freaking form, so
yeah. And then when
it
one was reissued, it was too late.
exactly.
I mean, in no way, shape, or form do I think either of us condone anything that went down there.
Yeah.
Um,
It was like
but
Greek tragedy. Like watching Ruby Ridge, and same with Waco. It was like watching a Greek tragedy where it's like both, like it's almost seemed inevitable and that the momentum built, and it was sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy where both sides saw each other in such a way that like there could only be one outcome and it could only be tragic. That's the weird feeling I get when I watch either of those.
the only thing with the Waco siege that I will say I think was less of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, or maybe just a little bit different,
Mhm.
because it was a 51-day standoff, and because there were so many opportunities for David Koresh to just lay the power down, and just like a big part of it was like sexual assault on younger women, spiritual
Oh,
wives.
yes.
If he had just stopped, it wouldn't have had to end like it did.
Oh yeah. When I say self-fulfilling prophecy, I mean like these are
He also
people
thought he
who,
was a god, so
yeah, these are people who have an ideology that says like we are going to be persecuted, particularly by like the government or something like that. And then, the government comes in not because they believe that, but in Waco's case, because of the molestation, because of the guns, right?
yeah.
And that gets perceived as like, oh crap, like our ideology is coming true. It's the end of days. And it was the same thing on Ruby Ridge, where it was like we have to hunker down and really lay siege or whatever.
Yeah, it's all so, I don't know, it's fatalistic in a way, like, you look at what happens, and you kind of stop and think about it, and it's like, what did you think was going to happen? Like, in the case of
They don't think
the
straight.
Waco siege, did they think eventually they're going to lose interest? Because as things built around the compound, there are more and more people becoming anti-government, anti-militia, or pro-militia, in the sense of like taking up arms, anti-militia as in the military, and anti-government. And you kind of got to say to yourself, like, what did they think was going to happen? The more people that arrive at the entrance to the compound,
Yeah.
like, obviously it's going to get more attention. And what's interesting is, actually, before coronavirus like really swept the nation, so to speak, my parents had gone to a wedding and they were in Texas, and I said, if you guys can you go to Waco? And they did, and it was very, very eerie and stuff. They took a couple pictures of the where the compound was and the gates that are still there, and then got the hell out of there.
Didn't they? Yeah, I think I would too. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the kind of weird, morbid tourism that I would go on too.
Well,
Like if I were in Ukraine for whatever reason, I would definitely go to Pripyat, Chernobyl. Like
oh
that.
yeah, I'd be like, get your backpack, let's go.
Yeah,
You know.
but I thought that they had rebuilt the compound in them. John Bronson, he goes to, actually, I believe he goes with Alex Jones to the site, to Mount Carmel, and Bo Greitz, the guy that that got Randy to eventually leave and surrender, he was
Yeah.
there, I think, rebuilding the new Branch Davidian, and I believe Alex Jones funded the whole project, which was like, that was interesting. And not only that, but Randy Weaver was there visiting as well, and people were like, "Oh, Randy Weaver!" He's like a folk hero because it was all people on the right that were there, and
Yeah.
Randy goes and like signs stuff for people, and
Which is insane, because it's like, he's not a hero. He's not a good person, but
I agree, and I also understand, because he has got like no way of making money now, aside from like the payoff that he got from the court settlement.
yeah.
I don't know how the hell he's gonna make money, so he just makes money whatever way that he can, which is like signing photo or posing in photos for people and signing stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
It's gross. I don't like it, but
yeah.
I get it too. It's
And then
a
that
thing where,
draws back to, like, there's all these fandoms devoted to people like him.
yeah, it's almost like, I almost look at it like the people in Africa who rip tusks out of elephants and horns out of rhinos. I'm
Uh,
like I don't like that. I think that's pretty horrific. But these people probably don't have much opportunity, and that's probably why they're doing it.
yeah, but
I don't condone
apples
it.
and oranges. Huh.
Yeah,
Well, apples and
maybe bad
I
example.
don't know. But there's so many layers to everything that happened. I mean, if you start back at the Holocaust, which I could, but we'll be here talking about it forever, so we'll put a pin in that, and at some point we'll have a discussion about it.
Yeah,
But and the way things have been set up, because actually, if I just jump back to that real quick, I'm taking a class this semester. It's a history class, and it's called Topics in World History, from Auschwitz to Israel. And one of the main things that we did was we went to the USC Shoah website and we watched the testimony of a survivor. I also discovered my grandfather has a testimony there, and I'm trying to get my hands on it, because I'd love to hear his voice again. But I watched, my survivor's name was Nathan Gibson. Gibsman. He was on death marches and stuff. And one of the last things that they asked him in his interview was, what would you tell the next generation coming up? And he was interviewed in like 94. And he looked at the camera, and most of the time he'd been looking at his interviewer, and he looked right at the camera and he said, "Don't think that this can't happen again,
So
because
true.
it
Yeah.
can and it will." And then I look at things like, the kids at the border and whatnot, and the people in cages, and other things that are happening now, politically. And I'm like, dude knew what he was talking about, because it's the reality of history will repeat itself.
Yeah. If you're not paying attention.
And someone, I'm not naming names, but someone ain't paying attention, and he's at the helm of everything. So he might want to, look up from the fast food and take
Yeah.
a gander at what's going on.
And some people raise the point of like, oh, well, obviously, like the example that you just gave, the kids at the border. I think that's a far cry from, sending people to the gas chambers. And it's like, okay, well, fair enough, but this is like the incrementalism. Like, people don't understand that, like, and there was a fascinating Jordan Peterson had a series of courses on personality, and the course about I want to say it was about industriousness. Maybe it was about the differences between liberals and conservatives, and he
Yeah.
was focusing on how high disgust sensitivity tended to be a more conservative trait, and it relates to trying to ward off pathogens and trying to basically build borders and boundaries, not only in the world of ideas between things, but also in the physical world.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so he talks about how in the extreme, what with extreme high disgust sensitivity, what you end up is something like Nazi Germany. And Nazi Germany started out with like, okay, we should cure tuberculosis, and so there were something like that, and there was a program to rid Germany of tuberculosis. It was a success, and then it was like, all right, let's focus on the hospitals, and then they started to clean up the hospitals, and then it was like, okay, now we should deal with the infirm. Then it was like getting rid of the infirm, and then it was okay, now let's focus on the Jews and the gypsies, and so it was like this mission creep, right?
Exactly. And when you've got someone who's anti-Muslim and Islamophobe, again, not naming names, but is probably looking at some fast food right now,
Yeah.
and thinking that he's, leading the crusade and fixing the coronavirus, but whatever. Again, who knows who I'm talking about? But as far as that goes, what you're saying is people don't realize that it's incremental.
Yeah.
It started with the Jews. It started slow in Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
Okay, these Jews are being taken because they're old.
Yep.
These Jews are being taken because they have a skill. Like my grandfather, he was a tool and die maker. When he was taken, so he got a blue card that allowed him to live. And my
things essential to the German war effort, basically, is that
exactly. And my grandmother, who went on, I think, 2 separate death marches, was kept alive solely because she had small hands that could hollow out the barrels of guns for the Krupp's company.
Whoa.
Her story is absolutely incredible, and I mean, I could talk about her forever, because her story, I mean, both my grandparents, their story is insane. They both went to Auschwitz and everything, but I mean, again, another story for another day.
Yeah.
But
okay. That puts life in perspective when your grandparents tell a story like that. You're like, okay, maybe things aren't so bad.
yeah,
Like,
I mean, I definitely, a few times when I've been like, I'm going crazy in quarantine, I've thought about them, and I've been like, you know what, they lived not knowing moment to moment what was going to happen.
Mhm.
I can ride out a couple months in my house.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean I don't hate it, but at the same time, like, I don't know, I think about them frequently. I mean, especially now that I'm doing this research. And one thing I was thinking about the other day was, I thought, I even said to my mom, I was like, do you think they'd be proud of me for the research that I'm doing? My mom goes, yes and no. And I remember exactly what my grandparents used to say. They would be proud, because it's the legacy and the lineage. But at the same time, the thing that they always said was we should not burden our young with the horrors we've lived. And for that, I would get, like, why are you doing this? You'd focus on something happy.
Yeah.
But I think, and I've said it before, and I will say it till I'm blue in the face, it is the duty of our generation to talk about this, because if we don't talk about it, nobody's going to care anymore.
Yeah. And that just lays the track for it to happen again.
Yeah. And in the case of my grandparents and stuff, like, they survived because they had certain traits and trades that they could rely on.
Mm-hmm.
And some people got lucky because they could hide. Some people got lucky because they had, the will, just the internal will to live. And when you start looking at that, and then you look at, what's going on in the world now, you're finding a lot of the same parallels.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you look at the next rise of Nazis, the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists, I mean, for me, at least, I'm just forced to go, why? What about history makes you think that whatever you're doing is a good idea? And especially deniers and stuff like that too. I will never understand a Holocaust denier.
Yeah. I mean,
11 million people just poof.
I understand the tendency to question everything, but in the case of the Holocaust, the Germans were known for being meticulous note takers. Like,
Yeah.
the German system, they took note of everything. So if there's almost anything in history like that is particularly difficult to question, it's the Holocaust statistics, because the Germans were so meticulous with how they orchestrated their death machine.
And even though, they tried to burn a lot, they, torched countless barracks and whatnot after liberation. It's still there. It's still in the notes. It's still in the documents. The documents are available.
Yeah.
And it's truly just mind-boggling. And you have to wonder, but I haven't found an answer for how people can look at that history and want to replicate it.
People that aren't really thinking too much about it, I think probably also people that just lack the personality trait of compassion or empathy.
A narcissist, if you will.
Yeah, narcissists for sure.
Sociopaths.
The book that I really recommend that was very eye-opening. So I had mentioned that I had read Mein Kampf. I'm not recommending that people in general read Mein Kampf. Actually, I got Hitler's Table Talk as well, which is things that he has said, not in his official speeches, that I believe Hermann Göring recorded him saying, his personal assistant,
mm-hmm.
at dinners and things like that. And I expect that to be pretty fascinating. But there's a book called Ordinary Men, and it's about a particular SS battalion that was composed of a bunch of men from this police regiment from a certain town. They sort of got absorbed into the Nazi, they got absorbed into Nazi Germany and made into an SS division. And it talks about how, like, these were Nazi ideologues. They didn't grow up with Nazism. They weren't part of the Hitler Youth or anything like that. These were just ordinary guys who, for ordinary reasons, whether it was career advancement, whether it was not wanting to like look weak in front of their peers, things like that. Some things as simple as that is what caused them to go along and participate in these events, and they were responsible for some of the more horrific things.
And that ties in a little bit with the alpha male and like the need to bond and be like, I'm superior to you, but we're like superior together.
Exactly.
And that's what brings together a faction like SS, the Atomwaffen Division, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, any of the people I've mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. That's what brings them together. A universal hatred and one-upmanship on each other.
Yeah. and it shows what this is something that really is essential that people realize is it's not just it goes back to the title of the book, them, is it like there's no, and there's a movie called, like, I don't think it can I think the, yeah, there
I
we
see
go.
it. I got it.
There was a movie called Them too, and it was about something entirely different, but like there is no them, it's us. Like it's us too, in the sense that like we can, if we think that there is a clear hard distinction between us and them, then we aren't realizing what we need to realize, which is we can become them if we just think that we're like some morally superior being that can't become them, whoever they are, if this makes sense. Like
No,
every
it does make
person is
sense.
capable of good or evil, and their conviction can shift if they aren't highly attentive to the fact that, it's not just Nazi Germany wasn't just something that sprung up out of nowhere. It was a bunch of different factors and reasons that normal people often participated in this horrific thing.
Yeah.
And if you don't see yourself as somebody that could ever be involved in something like that, then you most definitely will be somebody that is involved in something like that.
Yeah. And there's also the argument to be made of, like, God, what am I trying to say? It's like you're doomed to repeat the past if you haven't learned from it,
Yeah.
or if you think it's a bunch of bullshit.
Yeah.
And then you wind up with a lot of the scenarios we've got today, because you've got a lot of people that go, it didn't happen, or it happened in a completely different way than history has it documented.
Hmm.
And it really just is, it's exhausting after a while to think about and to look at all these different awful things that have happened. And you know you try to find the good.
Yeah.
You look for, you try. Right now, not easy. you know
Yeah.
but I remember, like, the one and only really serious conversation my grandmother and I ever had. Like, she was an angry woman, she was mad at the world and had every reason to be.
Hmm.
you know
She'd seen some shit.
yeah, she'd seen some shit, been through some shit. She earned
Mhm.
being mad. But one day I came home from school and I was pissed off about something, and she was living with us at the time, and I whipped my backpack across the room. And she, like, grabbed my chin and looked at me, and she said, "Don't be like me. Don't be so angry. Look for the good in the world. It is too late for me, but it is not too late for you." And I was like, okay. But it was the most serious thing she'd ever said to me, and it stuck with me now, because if you go looking for the good, you can find, 9 million examples of bad, but if you find that, like, one little inkling, that can change, in my opinion, that can change the course of how everything else is going to go, which does bring you back to the butterfly effect. But
Yeah.
I think that, if one thing comes from, if one thing comes from the coronavirus,
Mhm.
is that, well, you see two sides right now. You see these Trump supporters, protesters that are going out in droves to say we want our lockdowns lifted and stuff, which is, that's great. Go
I don't know
stand next
much
to each
about that,
other.
but that just sounds ridiculous.
It's
I'm
it's
not
true
surprised. I'm
though.
not remotely surprised, but
Oh
like,
no, I mean, and there's also neo Nazis that are being encouraged to spread the coronavirus through bodily fluids to Jews. Um, it's disgusting. But the other thing is, you see this whole other side of humanity, where, in my town, Cedarville, where I'm living now, I heard a bunch of sirens on Easter, and it ended up being the police, like, complete with a SWAT van that the Easter Bunny was coming out of.
I saw that on
Yeah,
your social media.
yeah, that was on my Instagram, and, like, you see these really great examples of people coming together at a distance, but coming together you know, the pay it forward stuff on Venmo where you're buying pizzas for nurses and stuff and things like that. And that's when you see this real cross section of humanity. And I think it's at that juncture where people have to make the decision, what side am I going to be on? What side of humanity am I going to stand on and go, this is where I lie on this topic.
Yeah.
And it's my hope that history is learned from. It's my hope and my desire to see the best in circumstances like this that will come out of this on the other side and go, okay, more people went along the lines of help the person next to you.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that will translate into a larger, less fucked up future.
Yeah. I mean, it builds on itself. And I love, there was this Edward Snowden video, or it was actually from the Joe Rogan podcast, where at the end he talks about how, like, all you have to do is lay down a brick so that somebody else can lay down their brick next to yours, and then over time people build up the future. And like, I really sound like a broken record with self-fulfilling prophecy, but it is something that I absolutely believe in. And there's something called the Pygmalion effect and the Golem effect. And
Yep.
yeah. So like, I definitely believe that humans are highly adaptable. Like, I don't believe that we're inherently good or bad. I believe if you have a system that encourages us to be any particular way, we're going to go that way, basically. And I
Yeah.
think that if you give people the opportunity and the encouragement and the incentives to lean towards the good, they will do that. And so that's sort of, I think, the position that we're in. And you can, it's almost like, you remember those old 3D glasses that it had one red lens and one blue lens?
These things are trippy.
Yeah. So when you look through both of them, obviously you see the full image, you see the full complex three-dimensional image. If you look through one, you only see a blue, through the other only red. So if you look at life through only one lens of the bad, you'll see all the bad. If you look through only the other one, you see the good. But if you look sort of combined, you see the textured fullness. And I'm not even saying that it's like 50-50. I think
No,
there's
it's
generally a lot more good than bad, but you can't
yeah.
just go through life looking through one lens. You have to look through both.
You do. You have to look through like both lenses, and you have to have. And I mean, it's so easy to say you have to have an open mind,
Yeah.
but the power of an open mind and the power of just really giving something a chance is, in some instances, the difference between life and death.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I think is lost on a lot of people. But I think, you know, if you look back at what history's taught us, and you know, we're living through history right now, if you were to put on those 3D glasses when it comes to coronavirus, like, yeah, you can look at the bad, and there's a lot of bad out there, you know, the amount of deaths, or you can look at the good, and it's small. But like, for instance, today I was looking at the news, and the chart for hospitalizations in New York City is down incrementally.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, that's fantastic. I know a couple people that have had it. One who was in a very high risk group, and it was a slow recovery, but he recovered. And it's those really small, like, it's a win. It's a really small win, but it's a win. And when you look at stuff like that, it kind of hopefully puts things into perspective that, you know, shit's bad, but it's not always gonna be bad. But if you perpetuate the negativity, it will be bad ad infinitum.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look back at these ideologies that Hitler, McVeigh, the big names that they perpetuated, what do you think would have happened if it had just been looking through the good lens too? Because they didn't. They had one eye covered the entire time and could only see the negative in what was going on.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think it would be naive to say that there are probably unique character, unique personalities, in the sense that some people that are going down those roads, if you intervene somewhere along that line and give and talk it through with the person and allow them to be wrong, and sort of the expression, give somebody enough rope to hang themselves, to
Yeah.
not literally, but like show them the holes in their own arguments or belief system, then you can save that person. I'm not saying it could have been done with Hitler per se, or the Columbine shooters or McVeigh, but like
Yeah.
in general, that should be the philosophy. You're not going to save everyone, but you damn sure have to commit to trying to save as many people as possible.
Yeah. I
And going
mean,
down that road.
if I've learned anything, I've been researching the rise and resurgence of neo-Nazism pretty steadily for about 2 years now. I started working on it when I got to UMass, and I'm getting ready to graduate in 2 weeks. There won't be a graduation yet, but it'll happen. So I've been working on this for a while, and it has quickly become apparent to me that this is what I'm going to devote my life to. Studying this and teaching it and just talking about it forever.
Well, I'll be there to talk about it with you.
All right, well,
this will continue to be an interest.
We'll be a team. How about that?
Fair enough.
We'll have our own TED Talk.
By the way, one last book.
Yeah.
The True Believer, Eric Hoffer. Great book. And I'm like partway through it right now, but it is really interesting. Mass movements.
Behind me, I think you can see this.
Oh yeah. Okay, so yeah, my stack up there.
Yeah, yours is not for Western literature. Mine is, but I'm almost done with all my school stuff, and then when I can, I'm gonna be like, can I borrow this book? Can I borrow that book?
Absolutely. I'm going to turn it into an open library. Granted, most people aren't going to want it, so this is going to be mostly stuff that you'd be interested in.
Yeah, man, I have some stuff that you probably want to read too, just like other. We'll do some tradesies, but
I figure that we'll talk. I had said at the beginning we'll talk military-industrial complex. We'll do that some other night.
Yeah,
that's going to be dense, but it does connect to this.
It does, and what's fascinating is that these subjects all kind of pull together. Like we started off the first time I came on the podcast. We talked about narcissism, which ties in big time here, and will for military industrialism, and then the subsidy that goes along with it. It's crazy. But yeah, like I was saying, I've realized that this is what I'm going to devote my life to studying.
Yeah.
And I kind of now wonder, what's the next thing? And whatever that thing is, can we reach it and give somebody the opportunity to not do whatever it is that they're thinking of? Mm-hmm. Like that coach that stopped a school shooter before they had the chance to get moving, simply by hugging him.
Yeah. Well, I'd never heard of that particular story, but that is the kind of stuff that it seems so small, inconsequential. It's not.
It's not. It's so. I think people lose sight of humanity very quickly, and in so many instances, if you just look for the good in the world, even if it's small and incremental, and if you're going incrementally in a positive light, that can change the course of history, which is a very big statement for just a minor idea. But in reality, the butterfly effect, one action changes the course of humanity. And wouldn't it be wonderful if that happened in a way that changed things around? And there's somebody else that's worth talking about, but I think that'll be a separate thing. A man named Christian Picciolini.
Oh yeah. Yep.
I would love to have a conversation with this man. a reformed white supremacist who has devoted his life to trying to bring people back around.
Mhm.
And that's one of those things where it's like that's a piece of humanity right there,
Yeah.
and something you can kind of look at and go, there's hope.
Hmm. There's this whole network of people that I'm hoping can be brought together and can collaborate and work together on in sort of seed projects and help each other out in this regard. And I see the John Ronson, Louis Theroux types as kind of the gateway to make a lot of people aware of this stuff by through their gonzo journalistic endeavors of going and staying with these strange groups.
Yeah,
I know that you and I both are fans of their content, and
I love Louis Theroux. I said it before, I'll say it again. I fucking love that guy.
and yeah, I mean, we need people to openly talk about this stuff and share it, and then you'll get this coalescing of people around this, because right now the domain of things that people feel is acceptable to talk about, or like people are just bored right now. There's
Yeah.
there's so little that people feel like they can engage or talk about, or have interesting conversations about, that they're craving this kind of thing,
Yeah,
and it's something to feel good about too.
it
So
is.
that's
I
what
I
I say.
think it's so important to have these conversations. I think it's so important to watch somebody like Louis Theroux, especially like America's Most Hated Family. I went back and watched it again, even though I've seen it a gazillion times. Like it's still fascinating. Then when you watch Megan Phelps,
It's Roper, I believe.
yeah, her
Yeah.
TED Talk, again, fascinating just to kind of look at it. And I think I told you about the YouTube channel, Cut,
Yes, you did.
and the
Sorry,
kids
but
that met her and talked to her, and it's just fascinating. And I think if people just like gave that a chance instead of what can I bitch about today that sucks, because I mean I can come up with 1,000 things to bitch about today that sucks. It was supposed to be warmer than it really was. I was not warm enough with a tank top and a sweatshirt, damn it. Or you can look at something else.
yeah.
It's perspective, and I'd be a liar to say that I've got this fantastic perspective where everything is great all the time and I can see the best in everything.
Mhm.
But I'm trying to look for the things that are positive.
It's a good habit.
Not always
You gotta
successful.
build the habit.
Yeah, I'm not always successful. In fact, I would give myself a generous 60-40
Hmm.
when I'm in a bad mood too. Like look out. But in actuality, like even with all the research I've been doing, and because you can fall down such a rabbit hole of negativity, I do kind of try to find what positive can I take from this,
Mhm.
even if it's just the Ruby Ridge incident, what we learned from it, the U.S. Marshals and government speaking, what we learned from it.
Yeah.
It if that's all I can take from it, at least it's something.
You can find silver linings in anything.
Yeah,
That's your mentality, and not just the lessons and the stories, but also maybe only maybe you sort of have to have a certain kind of mind to see this, or maybe uh, you know anybody can kind of come to view things this way. I'm not sure, but finding the little bits of humor in anything, and like an example is with Mein Kampf. I had read that Hitler liked to give out copies of Mein Kampf to people as gifts, and
you did. Yeah,
gave one to Mussolini, and Mussolini was like, "Oh, thanks, guy. I'll be sure to read that. I'm gonna put it right over here." Like Mussolini was like, "This guy is he's a megalomaniac. I'm not going to read his 600-page book."
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I don't know. It's it's crazy what silver linings you can take from it
Mhm.
too. Like although if Mussolini is like you're kind of fucked in the head. Like, stop and think about what you're doing, you know?
Yeah.
But if Mussolini's making that determination for you, then you got to kind of reassess your priorities. But
Yeah. By the way, that was maybe a weird example, but just in general, like
no, I mean
that John Ronson book has a couple other examples too, where it's like the Klansmen that decided, who normally burn crosses, who decided, hey, let's make a swastika and try to burn that, and they're trying to like put it up and it's falling down and they can't get it to go up, and then they can't light it, and they're like, should we put it up and then douse it and then light it afterwards, or should we light it on the ground and then put it up? And the guy's like, how are you gonna light it on the ground and then put it up, you idiots?
It's like, or maybe just don't.
Exactly.
Just a thought, you know. Maybe we just, you know, dial it down, reel it in, and chill.
Yeah.
But you know, for all those things that happen and all those, you know, those instances of just kind of looking at it and being like, shit. You know, when you have the opportunity to look for that silver lining, even if it's something as stupid as a swastika that can't get off the ground, literally, and find that like little bit of humor in it, that changes everything. And I think, you know, I've said something similar to that before, and they're like, well, where can you find a silver lining in the Holocaust? And it's like, well, some family made it out. That's a positive. And like random little stories that, you know, my grandparents would tell me. My grandmother had a story. She didn't talk much about it, but when she did, she would tell me about this guard that gave her his rations one day.
Those little stories of humanity.
Yeah.
There are pearls like that. You'll find them all over the place.
Or like before the war, she and her sisters used to take fresh cherries and put them through their ear piercings. Like, it's the most random thing, but it always made her so happy to tell me about it. And like, I was like, you know what? If that makes you happy, it makes me happy. I have yet to try to put cherries through my ear piercings, and I don't think I'm going to, because, you know, not trying to like hurt myself. I mean, like, my little nephew yanked on this one, so it's enough of an issue. He yanked on this piercing pretty hard, and I was like, I don't feel that forever. But that aside, you know, it's those little inklings and stuff, and it's that coach that stopped the guy from shooting up a school. It's those small things throughout the day that you find, and if you compile them all together and you look at it, the world's not such a terrible place. You just gotta look for it.
Yeah, get in the habit of doing it.
Try to, anyway.
On that note, I think that's actually a really good note to end on. Anything else to add? I should open up. Anything you've been dying to say?
No, you know, I mean, one of the great things is you give me a wide berth to talk, because I do talk. I ramble.
I ramble too. So ramblers get together.
Yeah, ramble on, as Led Zeppelin once said.
Yeah, ramble on.
Yeah, but no, this has been great, and I you know, thank you for having me again. Especially
this
to
is
talk
as much
about
yours as it is mine. This is an open source podcast. That's what I try to get people to realize, is that, you know, it's something. My room and a camera.
It's something great to listen to, and when we can get back in the studio, even better. But you know, I for anyone interested, when I did put on my Instagram about listening to this podcast, it was just because I thought it was a good idea. That had nothing to do with it.
Yes,
because a couple people did ask me. No, just because it is, you know, I listen to a lot of like true crime podcasts and things like that, so I am convinced, like, you know, someone's over my shoulder all the time. That's how much I've listened to it. But, you know, it's like we were talking about it once, it's like a niche type thing, but you give a lot of opportunity to talk about everything. And for someone like, I'm so excited about my independent study, and anyone around me is probably tired of hearing about it. But like, this is, like I said, this is the thing I'll be devoting my life to doing. And, you know, for people that want to listen, I will talk
Yes.
at length.
Right on. Well, now people are going to know where to. Well, if anybody wants to talk to you, I don't know. Is there a way that they can get into contact with you, or should they come through me and I can direct them to
I
you?
mean,
Up to you.
I have my social medias,
Okay.
and you can find me through there. You can find me through Pat. If you Google
I'll,
my name,
I'll,
stuff.
I'll say it through get in contact with me, and I'll connect you rather than
Yeah,
throwing your social media accounts on here.
yeah. Cause I know that tomorrow when this is gonna go up, I think
Yeah.
tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll do, my typical stories of like, I got to do this, you should go listen,
Okay.
Um, but you know, it's always a pleasure to get to talk. And like even when we're just like texting back and forth like ideas and stuff, you are tough to keep up with, my friend. Like,
I get a little bit too dense when it comes to like I'm not a very good texter. I'll just send like a paragraph or
well,
something.
no, because I do the same thing, or I have like the stream of consciousness, like all of this goes together and could be a paragraph, but I'm thinking about it singularly.
Oh yeah. I need to tone it down a little bit.
No, you're doing fine. You keep it interesting, and it's an actual conversation, not just like, so quarantine
Oh,
still sucks.
well, it's the hey. If somebody just says hey, that
Yeah.
bugs me out so much. Or that that really bugs me when people
If
say
somebody says
the onus
hey,
is on you. Entertain me. I'm like,
yeah, or if someone just says hey, I'm like, are you mad?
yeah.
Like, if it's like hey with an exclamation point, it's like, all right, this is gonna be a happy conversation. If it's just hey or like with a period, just look out because
I get it a
it's
lot,
about to get
bro.
real.
I get it a lot. So part 3 coming up soon. Military industrial complex and other stuff if you want, but
Yeah,
that's all I
I
got.
will come back anytime you'd like to have me.
Yeah, we'll do it next week if you're up for it.
Sounds great. I'll be that much closer to finishing school.
Good. We'll
All
do
right,
it
well,
as a graduation gift. All right,
thank you.
Sarah.
Thank you.
Good night, Sarah.
Good night, Pat.